Hi guys, tonight we're here with Carolyn Ann Clark, who's had a lot of experience with the entertainment industry and media, specifically as an actress. Carolyn, what records did you listen to as a youth growing up in Boston, Massachusetts?
The first artist that I remember having a crush on was Bobby Sherman. I had a little blue plastic LP player, record player. You guys don't know what that means anymore, but it was a blue plastic record player. And my mom bought me Bobby Sherman, and I went to the concert. But I mostly grew up listening to my mom and dad's favorite, which was Frank Sinatra. I was born in '58, so really I remember the music 60s, 70s was my era because I was a teenager in the 70s.
Nice. So speaking of your parents, did they were you allowed to play that music whenever you wanted, or were there parental limitations on how often you were supposed to play that in your home?
I could play whatever music I wanted in my bedroom. That's where my little record player was. But the big stereo was up in the living room, and my mom and dad would entertain. I also remember LPs being comedy LPs. I remember having a crush on Jerry Lewis, who just died. My father introduced me to comedy way back then. And Dean Martin, they used to have albums, and we would listen to those. And Herb Albert, I remember all of these. Herb Albert, it was my mom and dad's era. And then the Beatles came along, but my parents were kind of too old to appreciate the Beatles.
Okay, so what did your parents think about, these records and record players, and how much were they? Like, how much would they go for on average? Would you go to the record store?
My gosh.
Talk about that process, how you went to the record store and you would buy them
Right.
and, take them home with you. What was that feeling like, and how much were they?
In today's market, I guess it was the equivalent. It doesn't feel like it was as expensive as a CD is today. I don't really know the value. I can't even remember how much it was, but it wasn't that big of an extravagance.
Mm-hmm.
I remember we had, a whole case full, but again, that was my dad's. I only had my favorites. As I got older and I was in high school, I then listened to the Eagles, the Jay Giles Band, which was from Boston. I loved, who is the artist that has since walked away? Cat Stevens was my favorite. Carly Simon. So Simon and Garfunkel. That was all 70s.
Carolyn, what was your first experience recording yourself and hearing your voice?
Oh, well, 16 I started playing a guitar, took lessons, and the woman that I took lessons from would give me music to strum on my guitar, and we would have these little cassette players. Well, they weren't that little back then. It was about this big, and would put a cassette in, and that was the first time I actually heard myself back, because I'd have to practice during the week. Fast forward to my first commercials I got in New York City after I got an agent and went to New York at 19. And then I was doing commercial voiceovers. And so they would have me go into a sound booth, and it was one of those, I forget what they're called. The tapes were about this big, and it would go on to the next track. I still have them in boxes somewhere that I've done commercial voiceovers for. And that's my first experience. Then would hear it on the radio and hear it on TV.
What did you title that? Your first mixtape, which would be called today as a mixtape. Your guitar. Did you title any of those? And
no. Well, just no, because that was me rehearsing my singing lessons. But I would say those commercials were my voiceovers. They're called voiceovers today.
And so you have an iPhone, I assume, correct?
I do.
So what questions do you ask Siri? And when you first had that iPhone, was that a weird adjustment coming from your time?
Oh, yes, because I think the difference between someone my age and youth today is they're not afraid to press buttons. We were brought up kind of not used to these electronics. We got used to our little press one button and the record player goes, So, yeah, I think it's very intimidating, but it's also freeing.
What, back then, looking to now, I mean, you obviously couldn't dream up Siri, way back then, when you were 16. what futuristic sound recordings did you expect to have in the future, and which ones came true?
Futuristic sound recordings. I was never really technological savvy. I left that to the people who were working in the sound booth. So I didn't really think that way. I think the sounds that, I mean, musically, I can't believe how far we've come, but I still think that the Broadway musicals that I trained to sing in, so many of those keep coming back because we can't seem to find music that's as good as that. But no, I never had that space of mind saying what kind of phone is going to be designed next.
Yeah, how television? How accessible was it for you to watch it and some of your favorite shows and whatnot?
Well, my first memory of television was 1963, when our president, John F. Kennedy, was assassinated. I was 5 years old, and I think because it was so tragic, it was just my first memory. My parents had a little tiny black and white, and I remember there were 4 of us born then, and it was the first time I remember my mom and dad crying. And I came home from kindergarten, and my brother came home from first grade, and that was pretty important, like watching the assassination of our president.
So your first memory was television?
Television. Well, no, I had other memories, like my first chocolate ice cream cone, but my first memory of television was that incident.
Gotcha. Okay. So what was it like sharing, you grew up in a family of 8 kids. What was it like sharing one TV? And how did the remote work? And what was like that?
We didn't have remotes. I'm one of 8 kids. And what mostly that we do, as our TVs got bigger and bigger, I mean, first I remember little black and whites. And then the first color TV, it was in a console. Like it looked like a piece of furniture, all with wood around it. And, but we would just fight for the TV, but you would do a dial on the television. I remember the old rabbit ears in one of our first TVs where you wouldn't get very good reception. We didn't have cable. We didn't have, direct TV on our roof. So we did the best we could.
So how did it evolve ultimately over the years? Do you remember the next, so you talk about the rabbit ears, was there a next step after that you remember that television took?
Yeah, I remember mostly I remember the Sony Trinitrons. That was the big name that came out. I don't know if that was 60s or 70s, though. I really don't. But I just remember a better quality picture. And I don't even really remember when we got our color TV. I think I might have been about 12 years old, 11 or 12. And we only had one TV in the house, no TVs in bedrooms, just one TV in the family room where everyone had to watch the same shows.
So looking at it today, what is the weirdest thing, kind of like, is it DVR? Is it that you can rewind like what you watch? Like what is the coolest aspect of today's television that you wish you had back then? Just one.
Well, the remote. The remote is amazing that you don't have to get off the couch to change the channel. I mean, someone had to stand up across the room every time you want to change the channel. We didn't have the term channel surfing because one of us would have to get up and change the channel manually. But as far as how many channels there are, we had it memorized. We only had network television, CBS, ABC, NBC, and then your local Channel 5 or whatever. But all of these selections still overwhelms me. The DVR overwhelms me. I can't even grasp how that works, how it stops the show.
And last question about television. What was it like the first time you saw your face on a television?
Ooh.
Do you remember it?
I do. The playback from my very first soap opera role, it was before The Guiding Light. It was a show called Love of Life. Both of my grandmothers had listened to it as a radio show. And so I was so excited that I was going to work for CBS and play this student nurse who was a little tipsy from drinking too much, and called all my family. And when I saw myself, it was pretty amazing. I don't really like seeing myself. I don't think anyone really likes looking at themselves.
So, Carolyn, the first movie you went to, do you remember that, going to the theater for the first time?
I do. I was 8 years old and I went to see Winnie the Pooh with my parents, and it was so exciting to go to a big screen.
Was that in color or not?
I'm pretty sure it was, but when I see those old films now, I just think they look so not exciting. I mean, I was so excited by it when I first saw it.
And what was the rating system like back then growing up? What could a 17-year-old go to, or sorry, excuse me, a 13-year-old go to an R-rated movie, or was there?
No, it wasn't the same back then. First of all, we didn't have as many R-rated movies being made. And in fact, the rating system, I think, came out in the 70s or 80s. We only had a few movies that were a concern to people. So I wasn't concerned about what movies not to go to as a kid.
And so you were an actress, of course, that we know by now. And when you were on a film set for the first time, what was it like filming with film and not what we have today as digital?
Okay, so the first film I did was in 1990, South Africa, independent. I was there for 4 weeks, the leading lady. And the film is great. I was used to film from television. The only thing that I know is you have to keep doing take after take. The last film I did this summer with digital, you can keep making mistakes and keep just, okay, let me take that again, and just keep going because you can cut away at the digital. It doesn't make sense to me, but yeah, I thought that was actually easier for actors than what we had to do film. You had to take it from the top again, take it from the top on film. So that's why you would have a day of just doing 2 scenes if there were difficult scenes.
Thank you. So, and then just going to the movie theater today in 2017, what is that like, and how much has it changed since back then?
Well, the blockbusters, it's not my favorite kind of movie, really. I still like independent films. They're softer. We've come so far. Like, I don't like D-Box. It disturbs me. What is that special effect they do with
3D?
3D. It makes me sick. I get dizzy. I don't enjoy those new advances. I don't know if that's everyone my age, but I'd prefer just to see a good story and with a camera that's not shaking.
What films, looking back, have meant the most to you over the course of time?
Casablanca and Affair to Remember, but these are old films before my time. But when I took film courses in how to write screenplays, those are the ones they brought up. Sophie's Choice, I love Meryl Streep. I love everything Robert De Niro's in. I love people talking, and I like, not fancy special effects.
Ms. Clark, radio has been obviously around longer than television, and less evolved. We've seen radio kind of, the differences that we see from a TV standpoint with, going from no color to color, no remote to now a remote. With radio, we haven't really seen, at least from my perspective, have seen, that big impact, that big difference. What was it like back then? And like the first time you heard a radio?
First time I heard a radio was my grandfather had a radio out on his porch, and he was listening to the Red Sox game. That was his source of entertainment. I really didn't remember him in front of the TV. And then I remember my father painting our house once, the outside of the house, and he plugged in the radio and put it in the window so he could hear it outside, so he could sing to Frank Sinatra. When I was on the radio finally myself, I felt like, you're just in a sound booth. You got the earphones on, and you can't really hear anything. You hear your host asking you questions, but I never enjoyed really the medium because I'm a more visual person.
So how does that, do you remember advertisements being incorporated at first and how big of a difference that was than maybe beforehand? And when did that really start heating up? Because that is what the radio business makes money on, is advertising, of course. That's how they stay alive.
Yeah, I did a lot of voiceovers. In fact, I did a Sprite commercial as a 20-year-old, and we had to go into a radio station after doing the commercial. Nowadays, I think they'll lift from the commercial a voiceover if they want it separate. Back then, we would go and do a separate track in a radio station for that voiceover.
And so how is it, do you think, listening to the radio today, whether it's music or talk or, any kind of format, what do you notice the biggest difference that we can you could tell millennials how different it is from the 60s or 70s or 80s or 90s?
Radio?
Yes.
I would say just like television, the selection. We didn't have the Sirius radio. We didn't have pirate radio. We had a few stations that we could get in our little town that we were in. That was it. So you had your favorites. In fact, it's funny, even when I go back to Massachusetts now, it seems like they still play the songs from the 70s on the little radio stations. They still have the same stations.
Do you remember any educational radio programs growing up?
I didn't care to listen to educational. Now I listen to NPR all the time.
Was that radio always implemented in the car since as long as you can remember, or was that a new thing?
Yes. In fact, I remember my father having he loved old cars, and so he bought an old Buick from the 40s. It was actually the first car I drove at 16, and that had a radio. It wasn't a very good one. It only had one station that worked, but it was enough.
Thank you for your time, Mrs. Clark. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Justin.